Hello and welcome back. In today's video, we will discuss about implementing REST APIs with AWS API Gateway. REST APIs are used to send and receive information over the internet. The information is exchanged securely and it mostly uses HTTP or HTTPS protocol. This is what we are going to build today. We are going to use REST APIs to perform CRUD operations on DynamoDB table. As you might already be aware, CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. We are going to support each of these by get, post, put, and delete methods within REST API. We are going to use a Lambda function to handle the API requests, perform DynamoDB operations, and apply any transformations needed. And finally, we are going to make use of Swagger to describe or document our API. Now let's get into the AWS console and start building this. Okay, so we are in the AWS console. First, let's start by creating the base infrastructure. So we are going to create a DynamoDB table. I'm going to call this as books and use a partition key as ISBN since this is always going to be unique. And I'm going to skip the sort key for this particular example and leave all the other settings as default and create the table. As the table is getting provisioned, let's go to the IAM console and start creating the role for our Lambda function. So switch to IAM and into the role section and create a new role. And our use case here is going to be Lambda, as we are going to attach this to the Lambda function. Select next. And let's create a new policy. And the JSON policy document is available in the GitHub repository. I'll leave a link of that in the description. So head over to the GitHub repository and copy the lambda policy.json file contents. And this file has a couple of variables defined like the region name, account ID, as well as a DynamoDB table name. So replace them with your actual values. And this policy allows the DynamoDB table basic operations as well as CloudWatch logs operations. So just verify that once and click next. And give the policy a name. I'm just going to call this as Lambda policy. And once you have the policy created, let's go back to the roles and select the policy that we just created. And give the role a name again. So I'm just going to call this as Lambda role and save it. So now we have both our DynamoDB table as well as the Lambda role. So let's head into Lambda console and start creating the Lambda itself. So this time I'm going to create a Python Lambda. I'm going to just call this as books API and select Python 3.8 as the version. And under the role, select the role that we just created, use an existing role and select the Lambda role and create the function. And for the code, the zip file is available in the GitHub repository again. So download that and upload here. Save it. The last thing that we have to do in the Lambda section is to set up some couple of environment variables. So both these variables, you can find them in the README file. One is the DynamoDB table and the other one is the hash key. So in your use case, the DynamoDB table name and as well as the hash key might be different. So that's the reason I have put that in the environment variables so that you can just reuse this with the different variables. Okay, so now we have all the base infrastructure ready. So let's get into API Gateway and start creating our API. So you have various types available. This time we are going to use the REST API. So select REST API. And you have three different options here, either to create a new API from the scratch or a Swagger document or use the example API. So we are going to go with the second option, that is make use of Swagger document to create an API. So this Swagger file is again available in the GitHub repository. So select that file, and I have used YAML format. There is a base path defined as well as few parameters. One of them is a path parameter and the other two are query parameters to apply some additional filters. And then you can even define the responses for your APIs as well as the API methods itself. So we are going to define 5 methods here. There is one for get, then post. So the get is to list all the books, and then the post is to create a new book. So for each of this, you have to also specify how your response is going to look like, as well as any parameters that you're going to pass during the API execution. And there are some specific uh, methods which does query your exact book, and then it also helps you in deleting or updating the books. And there are some JSON schema definitions that will tie down your book request. So it'll allow only specifying these attributes, that is your book name, author name, and rating in this example use case. And let's import it. Okay, so once imported, you will see the various methods being created here. These are called as resources. And within each resource, you will have various methods and we have to set them up. So first, let's start by setting up the get method. And there are various integration types available. We are going to make use of Lambda function in our use case. And I'm enabling the Lambda proxy integration and selecting the Lambda function that we just created. This will automatically add the permission for your API gateway to invoke the Lambda function. So this is the flow of your request. So your request will first enter the integration request and then your Lambda, and the Lambda will generate the response and send it back to your client. So since we enabled proxy, there is no transformation applied at the API level. And we have to enable the request validator so that your request as well as the header and string parameters are validated by your API gateway. And you can see the various other definitions within your Swagger documents available here as well. You can modify them. You can remove or add different query parameters or as well as headers. And next, let's define the post method. Again, I'm going to make use of the same Lambda function. In your use case, you can even tie them to different Lambda functions. And I'm going to enable request validator again. We have to do this for every method. And I'm going to leave it to you. You can update each of these methods, delete, get, and put with the same Lambda function, as well as enabling the request validator. So once that is done, you can set up authorizers, as this is a separate topic in itself. I'll make a separate video for that. And gateway responses, if you haven't defined the responses in a Swagger doc, you can define them here as well. And models, these are the ones that we defined in the JSON schema, which ties down your request input. It'll validate against these schemas before reaching your API gateway. And you can even specify resource policies to further control the API request access. And your entire Swagger documentation is available under this documentation section. You can edit them here directly instead of making your changes in the file and importing it back. And then you have an option to see the dashboard of your API gateway where all your API calls as well as the errors that occur in your while accessing your API are displayed. And finally, there is a settings section where you can change the basic configuration like the name, description, or the endpoint uh, type of your API gateway itself. And finally, we are going to deploy our API. So for that, go to the resources section and select deploy API. So this will ask you to create a new stage. I'm going to call this as dev. You can have multiple stages for a single API like dev, test, or prod. So once you deploy the API, you will get the URL to invoke your API. You can use Route 53 to set up a custom domain as well. And here you have various options like to enable caching. So this caching is at API gateway level. So if you enable this, then API gateway will cache your responses for a certain period. You can specify the capacity of your cache as well as the time to live of your cache here. I'm going to disable this as this is just a demo API. And in addition to Lambda CloudWatch logs, you can enable logs at API gateway level as well. And you can specify stage variables in addition to our environment variables. You can even enable SDK generation, and there are various languages that are supported at the moment. And once you make any changes in the API gateway, you can even export the Swagger from here. And this shows you the document deployment history. And finally, you have a canary option for doing percentage level testing. So we are done with the basic settings. We are not configured any advanced settings for today. Let me know if you want me to do a separate video on the advanced settings. And let's test the API. So if you get into the method, you will see an option to test it. So if you run tests, you will see the response from the API gateway. And as you can see right now, we don't have any books. So the data returned is empty with a 200 response. So instead of testing everything from here, I'm going to try and test them from Postman. So let's get into stages and copy the API URL. And I'm going to use Postman tool. I'll leave a link of that in the description from where you can download the tool. And I'm going to copy that over here. And our URL is /books. I'm going to run the basic get call first. And if you send this, you will get an empty response first because we don't have any books created for now. And with a 200 response. And now let's create our first book. So I'm going to use JSON as our input format. And within this, we had 4 required attributes. There is ISBN, book name, author name, as well as rating. You can tie down the validation here. That is, since we have the JSON schema specified, you will be able to give only the specific data type for each of these attributes. So the first 3 attributes are defined as strings, and then the last one, rating, is defined as number. And once you have framed your document, you can send your request. Okay, so this was get, so I have to change this to post first and then send the request. As you can see, the record has been created now. It has responded back with 200 OK, which means that our request has been executed successfully. If you try to send the same request again, then you will get an error message saying that the book already exists. And now let's try updating the same book. So in this case, you have to specify the ISBN as the path parameter. Let's remove this and I'm going to just update the rating and send this. As you can see, it has updated the rating. Last thing that we are going to do is to delete it. So to delete it, it just needs the ISBN as a path parameter. And once you send this, you will get a 204 with no content as a response. Okay, let's demonstrate one last thing before closing today's session. So as you can see, I have created a bunch of records. And there are two query params that are supported with this API. You can apply them as in the get API. Those are the author name as well as the rating. So here I am filtering with the author name. I've just applied author name as Dan Brown. Then it returns only the books written by him. And you have also an option to specify the rating as well. Since there is no records with this combination, it returns a blank response. So hope you found this entire session useful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. See you soon in the next video. Thank you.